everyone, and welcome back to the channel. This is the Dark Light Emissary. This video is probably going to be a longer one, starting it off here at the beginning. As you see by the title, it's going to cover the Emperor of Mankind and the Golden Throne. So this may be one of my longer videos because it's going to go over some of the solid facts we know about both of them. But the biggest thing going into it with the Emperor of Man and the Golden Throne is both are steeped in myth, misinformation, and mystery, and neither gives up its secrets lightly, and it's likely we will never have every bit of knowledge concerning either of these important components to the overall setting. The Emperor of Man is, for all intents and purposes, basically the main character of the setting for us in a lot of ways. It's through his will that a lot of the current setting happens, and it's through his worship that a lot of characters are motivated. Whether they worship him as a god or simply as the greatest man to ever have lived. Many of our heroes we like, many of our villains we like or choose to dislike, like Erebus, all of them have some kind of motivation or another to side with or against the Emperor of Mankind because of the power he wields. And so anyway, I'm going to dive into a couple facts first, and a lot of this video though is going to be a lot of my theory and conjecture that I've been thinking about for a long time about the Emperor and about the Golden Throne. I think that the throne itself is super interesting and not often talked about a lot. It's kind of just talked about as like a thing, and we've got a bit more information about it from the latest Siege novels, The End and the Death Part 1 and 2, that we didn't have before those novels that I think are going to feed into some of my theory here. And the last theory that I'm going to talk about is probably the wildest one that I have. So, sit back and play one of your favorite grindy loot games if you want while you listen to this, because it's going to be a little bit of a longer one, I think, because there's a lot to talk about here. I am probably going to just simply have the nice map playing on the video this time, so there's not going to be much to see there unless you want to just see some of the worlds around the Imperium of Man on the Galactic map there for this one, just because I could put some images of the Emperor and the Golden Throne, but I'm sure most of you are familiar with them, and if not, a simple Google image search will give you a wealth of imagery for that stuff. But I hope this video will be informational and fun for those of you who have been interested in the lore for a very long time, as well as those of you starting your lore journey and somehow stumbled upon this small corner of YouTube and my video. And so whether you fall into either camp, I welcome you, and if you are returning and have subscribed already, I appreciate it, and I hope to earn some of you your subs for the rest of you. And we're getting pretty close to 1,000. We're 3/4 of the way there, basically, which is insane to me. To get to 1,000 is going to be an amazing milestone for me. I know it's nothing in the grand scheme of things, but, gotta take goals where we can get them to start off with at least. But anyways, I digress. So to kind of dive in, I want to talk about the Emperor first. The Emperor is one of the oldest entities in the setting. He is not the oldest. There are some that are older, but those are mostly Necrons. The Necrons kind of have a cheat code for, cheating death in a way. So out of all the mortal races, the Emperor is seemingly the oldest living being. I think possibly Alanius Person is a little bit older than him as a perpetual, but the Emperor is one of the oldest beings. So he's seen a lot. He's been guiding and watching humanity for all of those years. So already, he has a very long history, and much of that history is obscured or not really known. We only know very brief cliff notes about possible identities of who he was in older years, ancient times. We know he was a king, religious leader, conqueror several times. He put on different personas over the millennia based upon what he felt humanity needed him to be at the time. And still to this day, the Emperor's exact origins are still left up to somewhat conjecture. In the book, The Master of Mankind and the Horus Heresy series, we get the most probable, accurate telling by the Emperor himself to one of his custodes in a vision that they're having on a mind-to-mind discussion level. And, I mean, the Emperor doesn't really have a reason to lie to his custodies of all of his servants. They're his most trusted. They're meant to be his companions, right? His friends. He basically built friends for himself because he couldn't trust anyone else, I think, is kind of the whole thing. Other than Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor doesn't really have friends. He used to with some of the Perpetuals, which are, the reincarnating beings in the human species, but most of those abandoned him because of his ambitions and because he was very different from them. And so the Emperor's origins are still a mystery, ultimately, but we know he was born, based upon his telling of it, at least 8,000 BC, near Turkey, and he was born with his psychic powers, as far as we know, and using those psychic abilities is how he was able to keep himself alive for so long, as well as how he was able to manipulate events and make people perceive him how he wanted them to perceive them through his psychic might. And I want to emphasize psychic might. The Emperor is not a psyker. He is the psyker to end all psykers. No Eldari psykers, no old ones that exist anymore that we know of match the Emperor for psychic might. Pretty much everything else has a limit and a risk to their powers. If you overuse warp abilities, if you're lucky, your head might just explode, if you're a regular psyker. If you're unlucky, a demon might eat your soul and take over your body and masquerade as you, and then open up portals for other demons to come through. If you're super unlucky, you might turn into a chaos horror if Zench sees you and likes you enough. If you're also super unlucky, you might be turned into a flesh portal for more demons to come out. Basically, there's a lot more risks than benefits to being a psyker. It's basically a cursed existence for most psykers, I would say. Now, the ones that are at the pinnacle of this genetic lottery for psyker traits, like the Emperor and a few choice others, are able to use those powers to their own benefits. And this includes beings like Malkador and Magnus to a certain extent before he got doomed by those abilities as well, by being enslaved by Zench. Basically, the Emperor alone is not only a powerful psyker, but he is able to basically pull unlimited warp energy into himself and not worry about normal problems that regular warp users have. Now, that's to his personal corruptibility and to his personal risk to himself. You could say that the Emperor is also cursed because him being this powerful made him a gigantic target for the Chaos Gods in the warp. So he was so powerful with psychic ability that they could not touch him. In fact, that is where he gets his name Anathema from. He is the anathema to chaos energy of the warp, at least. He basically is able to purify warp energy in a way no other psykers basically can. The closest to this purity that we see for psyker energy is the Grey Knights, who also cannot fall to chaos as far as we know, like the Emperor can't fall to chaos. But this ability to do this is what caused the Chaos Gods to bend so much of their attention to cause the Horus Heresy to happen, to corrupt half of his Primarchs and Space Marine legions and supporting forces against him, was in a great fear of him. The Chaos Gods are terrified of that ability because the Emperor alone wields in his powers the ultimate threat of wiping them out. So of course they would want to be, against him. I mean, simply put, the Chaos Gods are kind of a representation of evil, ultimately, in Warhammer, to a great degree, but as beings that are simply looking to survive, and might be seen as a natural part of the warp, they're somewhat justified in fighting against the one entity that could kill them, for at least on a self-preservation level for those entities. It's not like I'm exactly rooting for the Chaos Gods to win here, even though I am a little bit of a Zench fanboy. But anyways, I digress. My point being is that when we talk about the Emperor being a psyker, he is a psyker unto his own, and he transcends just the title of psyker. No one else gets his level. It's possible Magnus the Red was at his level or close to it, since Magnus was slated to be his replacement for the Golden Throne, and because no beings seem to be able to feed the Golden Throne like the Emperor can. Malcador was considered one of the top psychers in the Imperium as well, in terms of power, and he was wiped out in hours, maybe days, alone, sitting on the throne. So Magnus might have matched the Emperor for raw power, but he couldn't control it nearly like the Emperor, didn't have nearly as many years controlling it like the Emperor, and he was seemingly unaware of the Chaos Gods until it was much too late, and he was pulled into the embrace of Zench. So again, like, the big differentiator is the Emperor not only can pull this power into himself, but he can pull unlimited amounts of it into himself without any risk to his person. Now, the only caveat to this is what we learned in the End and the Death Part 1 and 2 volumes for the end of the Siege of Terra here. We learned that the Emperor can pull the power into himself. The biggest consequence being if he pulls too much of it in, he actually threatens to become a fifth version of some sort of Chaos God, maybe, or at the very least, some sort of god in the warp that represents the darkest aspects of humanity, known as the Dark King. So, in his most vengeful and dark aspect, if the Emperor pulls enough warp energy into himself, he will literally manifest as a god in the warp and consume the other four Chaos Gods, assumedly, and become, like, the ultimate Chaos God of, like, dark human intent, for the most part. What that would actually mean for humanity and how that would manifest in the warp and reflect into real space, we don't really know. But we saw a bit of that in the End of the Death Part 1 and 2, where the Emperor started pulling so much power into himself on the Vengeful Spirit when they first got pulled into that trap by Horus that was set for them. He pulled so much power that he started burning like a negative star in the sky, basically. And he swelled with so much power that he became a featureless black orb of power that was he was becoming more than a human. He was becoming more than simply a psyker. He was becoming something way more powerful. But seemingly this would have served the Chaos Gods' plans, because I guess to them it would have been kind of a cosmic joke to turn the Emperor into something like unto themselves, a dark aspect of everything he once fought for, I guess. But ultimately, we see the representation I'm talking about, where the Emperor was not in danger of becoming corrupted by them. He would become corrupted by himself and pulling in that much energy to change his very nature into a apotheosis, into this godlike Dark King entity. Now, it's important to note here that the Emperor still was not out of control of himself at this point, and it's proven by the events of this book, where Alanius Person, his former friend from far in the past, is able to confront him and help convince him that the Dark King path was not the path to go on, that was not winning against the Chaos Gods. The Emperor, for his part, didn't seem to think it was winning so much as kind of just telling the Chaos Gods to go F themselves, ultimately. And he was kind of prepared to do that until Alanius told him to, kind of reflect on the paths, use this new power that he's, turning into to peer into the futures and see if Alanius is right to not go down this path. And ultimately, the Emperor does choose to shed that extra warp power back into the warp. And he also alters his personality a bit. He apparently breaks off parts of himself that are empathetic and more kind, so that when he is fighting Horus, he doesn't hold back, which is actually a change to the original lore, which says that the Emperor held back in that fight for a time because of empathy, because he loved Horus still, until, events played out to where he knew he couldn't save him or otherwise stop him without killing him. So it's going to be interesting to see in Volume 3 how that plays out. But the Emperor, at this point, with this kind of power, this is where things kind of get trippy. The warp is a weird place. That's oversimplifying it, but if you don't know much about the warp, it does not have concepts of like in real space. It's likened unto an ocean, but that's so we can understand it. It's not an ocean. It's a dimension that is not understandable by the human mind. If you peer into the warp, you will go insane. It's basically impossible to just look into the raw warp and not have your mind collapse in on itself, because your brain, your eyes, simply cannot translate what it is actually seeing in the warp. One of my favorite examples of this is in an older novel that I can't recall the name of, but it gives an example of a captain of a ship whose Geller field fails, and he's sitting on his command throne, and he's just looking up at the top of the ceiling of the ship, which is no longer a ceiling, but a sky. And he sees, like, trees grow in front of him and then decay and fall away. He sees, like, entire kingdoms rise and fall. Just all kinds of insanity. And then eventually him and his crew are, like, literally consumed by the warp itself, like, dissolved into the warp. Their souls eaten by, shoals of void creatures, like, in the warp. Beasts that live there and prey upon soul matter that comes in from real space. Like, their brains literally started, like, I say what was happening there is that their brains were trying to interpret what they were seeing by literally creating allegory in front of them. Like seeing objects that they were familiar with, kind of like when you look at a cloud and you see a shape that looks like an animal or something. It's obviously not intentionally in the shape of an animal, but that's how your brain automatically tries to see a pattern. Perhaps that's what was happening here. But the warp is literally the stuff of unreality. It's raw psychic energy. It's a place that basically does not have a concept of time as one of its governing aspects. There is no time in the warp, and this is important because what is conceived of in real space by beings that have a psychic imprint on the warp manifests in the warp symbolically. What I mean by that is, like, you look at the Chaos Gods, they all symbolize aspects of real space, despite them not being of real space. The experiences of psychically sensitive races in the Milky Way cause their existence, and cause what fuels them. Khorne being fueled by war and blood and skulls. Blood, war, and skulls are all in real space. They don't exist in the warp, but the echoes of those emotions tied to those conflicts created Khorne in the warp and the other Chaos Gods. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because once something is birthed in the warp, it always has been birthed in the warp. It never not existed in the warp because there is no concept of time. And so my thinking is, if we bring this back to the Dark King, does an aspect of the Emperor as the Dark King exist in the warp still, but diminished because the Emperor chose to walk away from that path? But because the concept of the Dark King exists, does a dormant version of that god now exist in the warp? And there's some talk about that in the End and the Death Part 1, where they talk about Slaanesh and how Slaanesh being born is kind of weird because once it's born, it's always there. Never wasn't there. And then if we get this even further along to where, the Emperor eventually is interred on the throne from damage done to him, and the throne is modified to help him survive for a time within his body, so he can still help humanity and cause Terra from not getting consumed by the warp or detonate with the Talisman of Seven Hammers as a failsafe. The Emperor is, over time, amplifying his power with the Golden Throne and by worship of people who come to see him as a god. But they don't see him as the Dark King aspect. They call him the God Emperor of Mankind, and he's seen in a more holy and majestic aspect by his followers in the Cult of the Emperor. And so this is where things get really weird, because if the Emperor is turning into a different version of a god, and not the Dark King, but whatever the God Emperor of Mankind would be, then does two versions of the Emperor exist in the warp? A more dormant, minor Dark King version still there somewhere, along with an ascending God Emperor aspect, which is like, warp being of light, and kind of anathema to the Chaos Gods writ large in a portion of the warp. Like, could you travel in the warp to a portion of it that is the Emperor's domain and visit with him, much like there seemingly are some iterations of the Chaos Gods holdings in the warp? At least sometimes there are. Like, for example, you have Nurgle's Garden, which seems to be a place you could actually visit if Nurgle wants you to. And, you could even survive there if he deems it his will. You could walk around it. And I don't recommend it. It's a gross place, but anyway. Point being, is there a place in the warp where the Emperor exists as a nascent god, representing the hopes, ideals, and light of humanity, and its, anger and frustration at chaos as well? Because with the Dark King aspect was the Emperor pulling so much power into himself. It was almost like his own personal power was alone causing him to ascend into this god of vengeance and hate, basically. It seems like this version would be like some of that, but tempered with the hopes and dreams of humanity woven into it. So, an entity that's a bit more on the light side of things, like a more justice-oriented god versus just a vengeance-oriented god. And the warp is so weird. I just wonder, are both of these aspects in there? And when the Emperor was, more of just a man, but with his super powerful psychic abilities, if he looked into the warp, did he see versions of himself looking back at him? And did that help motivate some of what he was doing? Because it terrified him to see what he could become because of how powerful his abilities are. The whole plan that the Emperor had was to use the throne to tunnel into the webway, which the webway is a capillary tunnel network that is seemingly endless, that tunnels throughout the warp, and was created by the old ones in, millions of years earlier to let them travel around the Milky Way without having to travel in the warp itself. It basically kind of is a way to bypass the warp, in a sense. And the Emperor's plan was to eventually have humanity live in the webway and then erase the psyker gene from humanity completely, allowing humanity to live like a peaceful existence in the warp, and then come out of the warp through the webway portals as needed, if they needed to visit real space again. But I wonder if part of it wasn't just for humanity that the Emperor was doing that, but was so he could hide from these entities that he could become, which is kind of heady and crazy, but the warp is also kind of heady and crazy, so I think it could fit as a theory about what the Emperor was ultimately doing before he was forced to sit on the throne. And then when he sat on the throne, and started becoming what he has become in 40k, which is seemingly something like unto a god. I just recently read Godblight, which is the third book in a trilogy about Robout Guilliman and him fighting against Mortarion in the Death Guard. And in this third book, it has some of the most important lore surrounding the Golden Throne and the Emperor that has been put down since the Horus Heresy books, basically. And Robout Guilliman's experience on seeing the Emperor, on witnessing the Emperor, when he went and visited him on Terra, is super terrifying on like a eldritch level. Like, the Emperor is not a man anymore. He is something else, and Robout felt that. And what's interesting here in this reflection of a memory that Robout's having, he's currently fighting Mortarion at this time. And Mortarion is defeating Robout badly. Like, at first, Robout gives it a pretty good go, but the book's namesake, Godblight, it's a plague that was especially created to kill a Primarch, and Mortarion injects it into Robout, and Robout is like decaying right before Mortarion's eyes. Mortarion's basically trying to convince Robout to fall to Nurgle with it, and it says that Robout retreated into a memory, and the memory he retreated into to try to hide his soul from Nurgle and Mortarion's temptings was the memory of visiting with the Emperor. And what's interesting about it is just revisiting the memory seemed to bring Mortarion into that memory and seemed to bring a portion of the Emperor's awareness into that time and place, despite it having happened in the past. Mortarion was aware of the Emperor's power there and of this memory, which is just interesting. It just speaks to again to the wonkiness of the warp and to how time has no meaning there to these memories. And then, in concert with this memory happening, there's other things going on that seem to be the Emperor influencing followers to help defeat Nurgle on this planet that Robout's on. And then it seems the Emperor himself briefly possesses Robout and basically tells Mortarion some things, tells the Plague God, he's like, you Plague God, your time is not, come, you still have a role to play. Like, seemingly saying that, like, Nurgle, at least, symbolizes things that are necessary to exist. And that kind of makes sense, considering Nurgle kind of represents intrinsic things like literal living and dying, versus like some of the more esoteric things some of the other gods represent, more symbolic things, I should say. And so after this event happens, like, Robout doesn't seem to really have a recollection of him being possessed by the Emperor. He knows that something happened, and he still denies that the Emperor is a god, but he has concerns now. And he has a discussion with Belisarius Call Inferior, which is basically an AI version of Call that can report to the real Belisarius. And Robout basically asks if the Emperor is a god or is becoming a god. And Belisarius basically muses on the fact of, like, whatever the Emperor was when he entered the throne will not be the same being when he leaves the throne. And Belisarius was obviously a being that knew the Emperor well at the beginning and was given great power to do what he was doing. And even Belisarius is basically saying, like, he's not sure that they want the Emperor to wake up. But the Emperor might be waking up with the Great Rift having broken open from Abaddon's doing. And that might have been a misplay by the Chaos Gods, despite the fact that the empire of humanity is split in two right now by a great warp rifts. That leaking of warp power into real space might be helping the Emperor as much as it's helping ascend some of the Chaos Gods and Chaos Forces for a time as well. I think it ultimately terrifies Robout to have the Emperor come back, because if the Emperor does come back and he does get off that throne, he is going to be this being of basically godlike a power with thousands of years worth of basically worship helping to feed his abilities, and that symbology matters in the warp. And so his soul being in the warp and being as powerful as it is to begin with, coupled with worship for thousands of years, it's going to bring out an entity that is all of that worship fed into the Emperor's personality, not just his own will. And what will that be? Humanity in 40k is kind of a scary institution, right? It's an institution of decaying power, but still a very angry and powerful empire in its own right, despite its decayed state. It's an entity that is vengeful. It's an entity that is hateful. It's an entity that wants to wrap its hands around chaos and throttle it out of existence if it could, it would do that in a heartbeat. And the Emperor himself is the literal anti-chaos as far as what he can do with warp energy. So combine that with the desires of humanity bent towards the worship of the Emperor, that entity getting up off the throne and doing what he is going to do is going to be partially fueled by the will of humanity itself, which is not necessarily, the most golden good thing. It's double-edged like anything with the warp is. And that could go in humanity's favor, or it could go possibly in the Dark King direction, where the Emperor becomes a darker entity and consumes humanity in his vengeance against the Chaos Gods for everything they have done. And so there's just a lot there with this, I just wonder if the Emperor in the pre-40k era saw this and saw this version of himself nascently in the warp, because before time aligns itself in real space at that part of the warp, I guess, those gods don't come into full power or being. There is, despite there being no time in the warp, there is some kind of alignment with real space in that case to a degree. But seemingly, it seems like there is the God Emperor of mankind in the warp. There is the Dark King version of the Emperor, and then there's the Emperor himself. And it's likely these three entities are somewhat separate, but also part of the same being all at the same time, and all ushered in by different events that have happened. And to kind of go back to how the Emperor was before he was on the throne, it's not known why he is alone so powerful with the warp energy, and why he alone is able to purify it the way he is. That is an unknown. The Emperor has never said why, and it's just kind of said matter-of-factly whenever it's brought up in the books. In Godblight especially, it's brought up that the Emperor's sword, for example, that Robout wields, just obliterates demons completely, gives them a permanent death. There is no, reincarnating in the warp for demons. There's no banishment for demons when just a sword imbued with the Emperor's psychic might touches them, let alone the Emperor in his mind or his presence. His very presence burns demons, with great pain, and then destroys them utterly. So Like, that is before his interment on the Golden Throne, and whatever that does to amplify his powers, with feeding him psychers, and then, again, worship. So, again, the Emperor is this superlative being. What he is, ultimately, is unknown. I think he is a human soul, and I do think that his psychic abilities are somehow intrinsic to the human species, perhaps because of what I talked about with time not mattering in the warp. The fact that the Emperor would become the God Emperor of mankind in the future, perhaps that power reaches all the way back to when the Emperor is not that yet, but he's still able to call on that power, and even he does not realize, maybe until later, that that's why. And when he sees it, I don't think he would be happy about it, and hence his plan to basically cut off humanity from the warp in the webbed way was his hope. I think he feared what he could become, and for the time he wasn't that, he wanted to try to use that power to influence and change the future, but that future had to happen for him to even have those powers, possibly, because again, time does not matter in the warp that way. And because time does not matter in the warp, it makes you wonder if the Emperor could reach back all the way to the Old One's time period. There is some precedence for time travel in 40k. Ahriman of the Thousand Suns, along with some of the Thousand Suns, were able to travel back in time to the Unification War era to do a couple of things. I think they were looking for one of their Primarch's soul shards there. But regardless, the fact that Ahriman was able to travel back in time would mean to me that the Emperor might have that same ability, at least to reach back and influence it to some degree, and possibly looking all the way back to like the time of the Old Ones, which I don't know what that would mean, because obviously what happened to the Old Ones is they were eventually defeated by the warp, basically, and by the efforts of the Necrons and the Catan overlords that ruled them at the time. But if there was somehow some kind of meddling by the Emperor because of how the warp works, I just wonder. Because again, he's this singular being. It could have origins from back then as well, for all we know. And then that kind of transitions us to the Golden Throne a little bit. I'm not entirely sure where this is said. One of you can comment if you want to about this, but at least on the wikis, kind of refreshing my mind about some of the things on the Golden Throne, it's mentioned that the throne seemingly was built during the Dark Age of technology. That's how old it is. However, at least as far as the End and the Death Part 2 is concerned, there was a bit of that book where Malkador is reminiscing on the past about the Emperor and who he was in prehistory, basically. That's what I recall, at least. And it's talking about, the Emperor basically having kind of conquered Earth at the time. It seems to suggest that he was Alexander the Great. It seems to talk about like a very early time period of Earth where the Emperor was kind of conquering parts of it, seemingly maybe to test himself. I'm not sure at the time, because obviously he didn't stay as a main leader of the Earth for super long. But it mentions that the Emperor was sad that there was nothing else to see, that he had basically seen, what there was to see on Earth at that point, as far as he was concerned. There was a sadness from him. But then it mentions that he found something, and that when he found it, that changed his outlook on things. And that seemingly was the Golden Throne, which would put, when he found it, possibly way earlier than the Dark Age of technology, which, if the case, means that at least the core part of the throne was on Earth and built there in ruins underneath a desert in Asia way earlier than Dark Age, which, who put it there and why? And what was its purpose? Was it an Old Ones thing? Because it seemingly has the ability to punch a hole into the webway, which is what the Emperor used it for ultimately. But it was also a warp power psychic mind amplification device of some power as well. And a being as powerful as the Emperor doesn't seem to have existed in pre-Earth times, back in the Old One times. You would think that if an entity like the Emperor existed that had the same ability at least to purify warp power and fight the Chaos Gods like they did, that they wouldn't have ran into the problems they had. Maybe I'm wrong in that, but like, at the very least, there were psychic beings powerful enough to at least channel their power through this thing without it consuming them, like it did to Malkador. And so it makes you wonder, like, who put it there? Why was it built there? And even if it was built by humans in the Dark Age of Technology era, what were they doing with it? Who was powerful enough to sit the throne then? Because if the Emperor discovered it and wasn't one of the people that helped build it, who was building it and for what reason? I don't think we'll ever know, but it's just something to think about, you know? Like, where did the Golden Throne come from? What was the goal of its builders? Was it simply a way to tunnel into the webway, like the Emperor used it? Or did it have purposes to stabilize the warp itself with a powerful enough entity? I mean, ultimately, again, I don't think we'll have an answer to this. I think this will always remain a necessary mystery, because ultimately it's fun to be able to speculate like this. You know, if everything is known, that kind of gets boring. So, the throne is one of the weirdest devices that humanity has. And there are a couple devices scattered throughout the Milky Way kind of like it. I mentioned one of them in the Ghoul Stars video. One of the chapters of Space Marines out there has a throne that they have psychic members sit on, that it seemingly they were told about where it existed by the Emperor when they visited the Golden Throne. So seemingly the Emperor wants to find possible other proto-thrones that are out there in space. And there's seemingly hints and mentions of devices like the throne elsewhere. Way back now, in the Mechanicum Horus Heresy novel, there was seemingly a device, kind of like the Golden Throne, being tested on Mars. And that also seemed to be some kind of psychic amplification device. And the person they had sitting on that throne, when they tested it on him, he basically ascended to become something different. Some kind of warp entity, I think. Not a demon. Not a chaos thing. But he ascended somewhat, and I still remember this to this day because it was just so distinct, but like someone else that was there, you know, was like basically like sad, like he was dying, and he was like, oh, you know, don't feel sorry for me. There's no reason to feel mercy for me. I'm basically fine, and I am currently witnessing amazing things, as he was like dissolving away from that throne into possibly the warp or whatever dimension it sent him into. But he seemingly didn't die and was not at all disappointed in what happened to him, which makes you wonder what will happen when the Emperor supposedly dies on the Golden Throne. Will he actually die? And that's either left up to the throne and what it will ultimately do with a being as powerful as the Emperor, or that will have to do with the Emperor's own perpetual abilities and his possible ability to reincarnate. Malkador is not able to do that, even though he was a perpetual, but the Emperor might be able to, with how powerful he is in comparison, even if he does die. But if he does die, that supposedly speaks to Terra's doom ultimately, as far as the Talisman of Seven Hammers is assumedly still, you know, bolted to the throne from Vulcan. And if that's the case, then Terra would explode and burn a portion of the warp itself in that explosion. I'm guessing that the Emperor might find a way to disable that failsave if his goal is to be reborn right there in the throne room, And if that's the case, then he might be able to do something about that. But anyway, pure speculation on my part there. Now, there was some old lore that, not lore, but I remember theory, going back 10 plus years, speculation amongst lore people that the Emperor could even be an old one himself of some kind, that he is a throwback from way back, trying to exact vengeance for his species. But the Emperor comes across too much like a man to me, like with human intents and wants and a desire for humans to ascend, which, unless the old ones, I guess, created humanity and love them that much, doesn't make much sense. The Emperor creates the Custodes, for example, as a ultimate expression of like idyllic man in a way. Just certain things the Emperor does seem to praise humanity as a species, and so he seems to just be like the one singular being of the species, and his ultimate aim seems to either be ultimately selfless or ultimately selfish, based upon the theories I've posited. Either he wants to save humanity through that Webway project that he had going, or save himself from a future he did not want to see for himself. Or maybe a mix. Who knows? But so anyway, those are some of my theories and thoughts on the throne and the Emperor. There's a lot more to talk about here. Ultimately, I could kind of just go on and on about this for a while. But I think I'm going to leave it here because we're approaching an hour's worth of me talking here. So if you've made it this far, I appreciate it. Hope you had fun on whatever you were doing while listening to this. Because I highly doubt you just sat and watched this video. I certainly wouldn't have. But I appreciate you listening. If you want to further this discussion, please leave a comment. I do like to read your comments and discuss with you. And if you have any topic ideas, please leave them there. I'm always looking for new things to talk about here. If you have a question about anything, I can answer it there or in a video if you request it. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to. Let's get to 1,000 subscribers. And I appreciate your time and willingness to come to this channel and visit it, whether it's your first time or you've been here since the beginning or any time in between. So, as always, have a great day or night wherever you are. I'll see you in the next one, and thanks a lot for your support.